Rugby eligibility is getting a change from the 1st of January next year, which is going to allow players to change which country they represent. After they've represented one country, they will be allowed to represent a second one. There are a few kind of rules to it, but we'll go through how it works, some of the potential positives and maybe negatives about this change, and some of the guys who we may see in action for other countries. I think World Rugby voted on it yesterday, and apparently the vote just snuck through. They got enough votes. I don't think all the ways each country have voted have been kind of publicly announced. Apparently the RFU, so England said they voted for it. Portugal said they voted for it, which was maybe one of those countries who could have potentially voted against it. New Zealand, I think, always has voted for that kind of thing in the past, so I wouldn't be surprised to see of them kind of voting for it, but I'm sure that kind of detail will come out in due course. But yeah, apparently it was close and needed 75%, but they did get the vote. So what does this mean? It means players who have got a close and credible link to another country will be able to switch from the country they have first represented to a second country, provided they go through a 3-year stand-down period, so 36 months stand-down. So you can't play any rugby or test rugby or sevens or anything like that, men's or women's. Yeah, it applies to all. So yeah, it's just standard 3-year stand-down period. Now, what does the close and credible link mean? It's kind of the standard eligibility criteria, and that you could switch to a country you were born in if you're representing a country other than the one you were born in, or the country of your parents' birth, or the country of your grandparents' birth. It doesn't allow you to switch to a country based on residency. So, I mean, one of the guys we'll get to a bit later is Charles Piertel. He would be able to switch to Tonga based on his parents, but he wouldn't be able to switch to, say, England, because he's been living in England for 3 years. He's already been capped by the All Blacks. The 3-year stand down does not apply to residency, so it's going to stop guys from kind of switching that way. You couldn't move to Japan and play for Japan based on residency either, that kind of thing. So it's fairly standard kind of rugby stuff. There are potential situations where you could potentially have a passport for a country and not be eligible for them if you weren't born there, if your parents weren't born there, or if your grandparents weren't born there. You can also have that situation where people might argue it's a pretty tenuous link to someone's granny, but the link is there nonetheless, so you will be able to make that switch. So yeah, it's largely seen as a win for countries like Tonga and Samoa. A lot of people reference Fiji as kind of a big winner. I'm not sure Fiji will get as much out of this as Tonga and Samoa will, because Fiji just produce so many homegrown players. I don't think they need to. Like, I looked at the old Rugby World Cup stats from 2019. Like, Tonga had 19 players from overseas, mostly Kiwis, like 17 Kiwis and 2 Aussies. Samoa had 18, 15 Kiwis and 3 Aussies. Fiji had 4. So Fiji's not really been ever reliant on overseas talent. Fiji gets lumped in with the other 2 islands, but Fiji just seems to go along pretty well without tending to need a heap of players. That being said, there are a lot of Fijians playing abroad who may potentially look to come back, but I don't think there would be a huge chunk going to play for Fiji. Would you get in? The Fijian squad's a pretty competitive one. So, I mean, what are the positives? Obviously, the easiest one is you get top caliber players playing for international teams. That can only be a good thing, in my mind. If I'm going to sit down and watch a game, I mean, just for me personally, when I'm looking at the team sheet, if I see a bunch of names, man, I know him, he's awesome, then that's better than, geez, who's he play for? Plays for some amateur club in Taranaki or something? You know what I mean? That's just, the spectacle is going to be better if you've got the best guys on show. I think that's kind of natural, although maybe not all will agree. And you do get this, and it's largely connected with the Pacific Islands again, but the whole idea of playing for a place where you've really got a connection to your kind of heritage, it seems to be especially felt or expressed by, I mean, like Adi Savia was one guy. He basically said, I mean, this is a dude with a heap of All Blacks caps, who's a starting All Black, basically said that his Samoan blood goes back thousands of years, and that he would love to represent Samoa one day, but he still loves to be an All Black. So yeah, there seems to be a stronger connection, but it's not just the Pacific guys that will that will make use of this change, I am sure. What are any potential negatives? I mean, I suppose there's a situation where if there is some breakout player for a tier 2 country, or even a tier 1 country, they could potentially get poached by another country as long as the player is willing to go through a 3-year stand down. So, I mean, that would have to be, again, you can't do it based on residency, but if you genuinely had a connection to 2 different places and you'd already represented, like if you'd already represented Tonga, but your dad was from New Zealand, and then you were playing for a New Zealand Super Rugby team and you were getting messages from like the All Blacks, just wait 3 years and we'll cap you. 3 years a long time in elite rugby, but there's a potential for that to happen. It's not, some people suggested you could make it, you can only go tier 1, tier 2, but this is kind of, this is no holds barred. So anybody can go from anybody as long as you have that close and credible link and you've got the 3-year stand down. The cynical side of me does worry that you'll only see some of the top guys go to represent tier 2 nations at Rugby World Cup time. Like, how many guys are going to want to take time out from their kind of busy lives and their family lives to go play in the Pacific Nations Cup? Maybe, and maybe I'm doing the competition a disservice. Maybe sometimes guys really will, but I feel like sometimes maybe guys won't. If the matches aren't kind of those elite caliber ones, like a Rugby World Cup. I'm sure Rugby World Cup we will see stacked sides, but outside the Rugby World Cup, I'm a little bit more skeptical. And the wider problem of the clubs not releasing the players is not going to go away. So just because these guys are now eligible doesn't mean that the club's going to give them a blessing, or, I mean, you're still going to see guys who leave their club and have got less than a week to prepare for tests, right? That's not going to go away. Like, you could have a really stacked side full of former All Blacks or Wallabies or whatever, but if they haven't got the prep time, I mean, again, the Rugby World Cup's probably an exception, but that kind of problem is not going to suddenly disappear. So that's a wider issue. But, I mean, this is at least one step in a direction to kind of change that. Maybe there's a little bit less incentive to home grow and a more acceptance that you can just, wait for some kind of former All Blacks or whatever to become available. That's a potential negative. And there's other countries like Uruguay, like Georgia, like the recently kind of on the scenes Chile side, Romania, like all these sides who pretty much exclusively home grow their players, who, if they're looking at like a World Cup repechage match, suddenly have a harder job to make the World Cup because they're kind of being punished by other guys being able to switch. I don't know. It's a tough one. There's kind of no right or wrong way because someone's going to suffer either way. But yeah, it maybe seems like a slight punishment for countries who do their best to home grow talent that other countries can rely on other countries, can't rely on other countries kind of gifting them players. I don't know. You guys have to let me know your thoughts on that. Some of the guys who may potentially see a switch, there's a bunch of Samoan and Tongan guys, a few Fijians. I mean, just the ones that I've kind of thought of, and I've seen some of them mentioned in the media. Julian Savea, would he get in? Probably. He's getting a wee bit on, but he's still a young man. Stephen Luatua, Charlie Faumuina, Francis Saili, Lima Pasapuanga, all these guys could play. I should say, because I know there's going to be some comment somewhere about, yes, this will get back at the All Blacks for plundering all those players. Like every guy I just mentioned is born and raised in New Zealand, so just kind of FYI. Tonga, I mean, Feketol was already eligible because he went through the Olympics loophole, so this is not going to benefit him, but he was already eligible. Vaya Fafita's one. George Moala, Israel Folau, Nani Lamapi. I don't think he would be able to make the World Cup. I think he's a year too late, but Lamapi could potentially play. Peter Aki is another one. So there's a bunch of Tongan and Samoan guys who could potentially line up for their sides. For Fiji, Nathan Hughes, Waisake Naholo, but would Naholo really get into the Fiji side? Seta Tamani Valu, maybe. Those are the kind of like typical examples that you see everywhere, but there's random ones as well. Like Jack Dempsey could potentially play for Scotland. He's not played for the Wallabies for a while. I think Alex Lazowski could play for Italy. I think he's eligible, could go from England to Italy, so that's tier 1 to tier 1. Luke McGrath, I don't think he's played for Ireland for a while. He could play for Canada, although they're out of the World Cup, so probably unlikely. Jordy Murphy, I think, could play for Spain, the Irishman. I think Sergio Parise could even play for Argentina. He's got 142 caps for Italy. Is it 142? It's 140 something. He's one of the most capped players of all time, and yet he could still switch. Maybe they could have put in a restriction like if you've got 10 caps. I don't know. I'm kind of keen on less paperwork, right? The more restrictions you have, the more complicated it gets. But yeah, Parise, wouldn't it be crazy to see him line up for something other than Italy, someone other than Italy, after playing 140 odd times? So yeah, it is an interesting one. I'm sure it's good news for the World Cup. Ultimately, I think it means a more competitive World Cup. But as I said, I still think there's going to be issues with the clubs. I don't think that'll be kind of easily solved just by this. And I am skeptical as to whether we see much benefit outside World Cup time. But I am obviously hopeful. I will try to put the skeptical side of myself to the side and look optimistically to show that this will just ultimately mean more competitive matches, which I am always a fan of. So there you go. You guys let me know your thoughts. Do you think this is a good move? Do you see any other potential pitfalls? Because anytime you make changes, there's always going to be kind of a loophole or some kind of unintended consequence. Can you see anything there? Do you think this benefits the game overall? Any other positives that I haven't mentioned? Other players, I'm sure there are others that I kind of haven't mentioned. The Vunipolas, I think, could switch eventually. But they wouldn't make the World Cup because they've played for England too recently. Like, there's a bunch of other players. But yeah, you guys let me know your thoughts, and I will talk to you again soon. See you later.